My guest this week is Narayan Devanathan, who is a multi-talented executive at Dentsu, the Japanese advertising company, where he does many things, all in the spirit of Dentsu's global philosophy of championing meaningful progress. He was actually recommended by Bibhash Banerjee, a previous guest on Think Inspired, who described Narayan as an insight machine and one of the most brilliant people he knows. So naturally, I couldn't pass up on the opportunity to jam with him. Narayan also happens to be a long-distance runner who claims that much of his thinking and ways of being have been shaped in the time he spent on the road, because, in his words, in the long run, everything works out. Beautiful. Narayan, welcome to Think Inspired. All right, Narayan, hi, how are you doing?
I'm good. Always glad that it's a Friday and complain too much. And it also looks like the relentless, humid, atrocious Delhi weather is relenting a little bit, and we might be seeing some rain over the weekend. So not complaining about that either.
Yeah, I'm in Bombay right now, so there's lots of beautiful rain, and I was just in Darjeeling where there was also a lot of like incredible rain. So I'm in a very rainy mood, but I love rain. So, anyways, it feels like a good time to talk about inspiration for a few hours as we're winding down the week, right? So, why don't we go down our first rabbit hole? I have a big question for you. What does inspiration mean to you?
That is a big rabbit hole. I found it recently in a very unlikely place, but maybe it's just my perception that made it seem unlikely. But I'm involved in a bunch of things outside work, and one of them involves this slightly underground movement on constitutional values. And I was talking to this young woman in the heart of eastern Uttar Pradesh in Bundelkhand. And it was a group meeting. It wasn't just a one-on-one conversation. At the end of the meeting, we were wrapping up, and she said, I'd like to share a few lines that I've written.
Okay.
And we said, please go ahead. And so she shared them in Hindi. If you don't mind, I'll share them in Hindi as well and then translate
Please.
it, right? And they had such a deep impact on me. She said, वो कहते हैं कि या हम वो कहते हैं हम हारेंगे, वो कहते हैं हम हारेंगे, हम कहते हैं या हम जीतेंगे या हम सीखेंगे.
Wow.
Right? So, literal translation, they say we'll lose. We say we'll either win or we'll learn. And she was, she has the wrongest choice of words probably, but she has the privilege of all of the social, economic, political disadvantages on her shoulders. She's from one of the lowest castes. She lives in one of the most backward areas in UP. She is a woman in an extremely patriarchal social setting. And yet here she was bringing that courage forward and inspiring those of us who had a lot of those that she didn't. So what does inspiration mean? I don't know. It's the thing that makes you get out of your cocoon and say, there's so much more. Get out there and discover it.
Wow, that's such a powerful story. I think I'm still processing what, the gravity of those words. It's so applicable to almost any context, right? Almost anything. Again, this is possibly due to my current filter bubble, but I was, as soon as you said those words, my mind immediately went to entrepreneurship and company building, right? Because as a founder, there's always this perpetual like potential fear of failure, right? That like no matter what you're doing, like, oh man, what if it doesn't go to plan? But it's so true. Regardless of the outcome, you are left with so much learning, knowledge, wisdom, and personal growth. That's truly what it's all about. Everything else is actually incidental.
Yeah.
Wow, that's beautiful. Really, really powerful.
Yeah.
So, and I love the fact that we didn't start with work necessarily. Although I would like to talk a little bit more either now or later in the conversation, because I think I always find people like yourself pretty fascinating, right? Because it's almost like you're responsible for a lot of creativity in the world, and creativity is almost like your currency, right? Being a part of the Dentsu network, like that's pretty much the currency. And so I find for you guys, it's very serious, right? It's not like you're hobbyist painters, and sometimes you'll feel inspired and you'll put something out, and sometimes you won't. No, it is your bread and butter, and there's this big, well-oiled machine that clients pay to be creative. So we can talk about creativity, but I'm also really interested in its almost like antithesis and the other state when you're not feeling creative or you're feeling deeply, deeply uninspired, either personally or professionally. So tell me, what do you do? What do you do when you're in that state where, you're not meeting really inspiring women in the villages of India or wherever? Like, how do you navigate that?
Again, too many lessons learned over time to not be able to pinpoint just one thing over here. But my other friend, philosopher guide in life is Calvin by Bill Watterson. And I don't know if you remember this one strip of his where Hobbes reminds him and says, don't you have that assignment due to turn into school? And he says, Calvin says, oh, that's due next week. So Hobbes says, shouldn't you be working on it? And Calvin says, you can't just turn creativity on like a faucet. You have to wait for the right mood to strike. And Hobbes says, what mood is that? He says, last minute panic. So a lot of times, actually, it is true, right? When you don't have an option, then you come up with the ideas. But I think there's a little more to it than that. There's obviously a lot of work that goes in before that, and I use the word work carefully over here, because I think when you enjoy the act of collecting all kinds of dots, then the process of those dots connecting is almost reflexive, but even more than that, it's so joyful.
Yeah.
So actually, there isn't any panic, if you ask me, and I also marry that with the fact that I work for a Japanese company, and there is no such thing as last minute. It is just in time, right? But I think maybe I will get to a place where I'm overconfident in my own ability. But at this point, I believe that if you manage to gather enough insight, I'm not using the word information or knowledge alone, that isn't sufficient, right? Then you will be able to connect the dots in unexpected ways, and that's what inspiration is eventually. But you have to trust yourself to be curious enough to say, I don't know what this is about right now, but this looks interesting. Let me find out about this anyway, right? And then the dots connect. I mean, my other inspiration, since we're talking about inspiration, is actually Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. Holmes, I think, in one of the stories tells Watson, when Watson asks him, or Lestrade asks him, so what do you think? What is your theory about this case? And Holmes says it is a capital mistake to theorize without having all the facts in hand. And often that's not visible, that you are so diligent about collecting all the dots without presumption, because you're confident that the dots will connect. I don't know if yeah.
No, absolutely. And I love this metaphor, and I love the way that you approach that metaphor as well, because in life, it's almost a cliche that just connect the dots, right? Or this person's good at connecting the dots. But to connect the dots, you first need dots, right? And not necessarily just any dots as well. I truly believe like the context and quality and breadth of those dots matter a lot, and we don't necessarily talk enough about that. So you've given me so much like raw material here, and I could go in so many directions, but I'd like to stick with that metaphor a little bit, if I may. And I'd love to hear more about how do you collect those dots, right? Again, either personally, professionally, like what's your particular process? Because it sounds like what you're saying is that if you take care of just consciously collecting those dots, everything else always sort of works out, right? Like you, as you said, it will be almost reflexive, instinctive. But you've got to keep your creative tank filled with those dots. So what do you do?
Yeah, I'm good. I had the advantage of having absolutely brilliant mentors over the course of my career. And one of my old bosses at the beginning of my career, he said, your job is to increase the odds of serendipity. And I said, it's one of the most beautiful ways of expressing, I think, the whole dot connection process. But I don't know if you can see behind me
a lot of books.
Shelf, right? I mean, I'm not a big shopper. I don't buy stuff, but I can never resist buying books.
Yeah.
Whether I've got the time to read all of them end to end or not, I will pick them up, I will start them, and I will tell myself that someday I will finish them, but I'll at least get to them, right? Maybe I'm just lucky I got this curious gene in me. But it is one of the best things that I've got, and maybe I need to thank my parents for instilling that in me. But it is something that is always at arm's length, right? It is only as far as that. I mean, just be curious about anything and everything. I mean, there's a book somewhere in there about how to play cricket by Don Bradman. Okay, it's one of the most basic rule.
Amazingly, I've read that book. I think I read it when I was like literally learning to be a batsman at the age of like 9, 10. It's an awesome book.
Then there's a book written in 1982 or something on how the civil services work in India. I have no idea why I picked it up. But I picked it up and I read it, and I have no idea when I might put it to use. But it just feels good to, push the blood through your head with something new in it. Books are just such a fabulous way of traveling without leaving your physical location. And the second best is obviously just to get out there physically. I mean, that's my other thing. I think, I can't use the unflattering Punjabi description of me and my restlessness. But as somebody said, do you have wheels for feet? Because I love to just get out all the time.
Beautiful. I couldn't agree more, and I relate as well. I don't really buy a lot of things in my life. I have a couple of like prized possessions, my Royal Enfield motorcycle, but otherwise it's my library. Like I'll just compulsively, obsessively buy anything and everything. Most of it's not necessarily quote unquote relevant to my work or my day, but I just I love the phrase actually, just pushing the blood through your head. I just feel like that creative nourishment is really important. And it's not really explainable, right? Yeah. I can't. I don't know how it's impacting me. Maybe all of this is like I read a copious amount of fiction, and maybe it's a complete waste of time, right? And I've just convinced myself that this is meaningful because I like to write fiction, but actually, when it comes to day-to-day living, there's not much necessarily tangible use of it. But I do feel that there's so much power in perspective and cultivating empathy. And I also like the fact that, in a world of Instagram reels and capturing, and marketers and Dentsu machines trying to capture attention in like 2-3 seconds or within a second, I think there's just so much value in living in a perspective or a world for a significant amount of time and committing to that process of empathy. Right. I don't know how exactly, but intuitively, I feel like that's an important process.
And sometimes, again, to the whole point of dots connecting beautifully, unexpectedly, one of the books that has had a deep impact on me is this book called Born to Run. I run marathons. I don't know if you've come across this book. There's a guy called Christopher McDougall. And he traces how the dots connect between biomechanics, anthropology, running, sports medicine, race, um, and the world of drug lords in Mexico, if you will, right? Uh, and one of the most fascinating things he traces back to is actually how running is closely linked to the very act of imagination. If I may, right? I mean, it speaks about our ancestors in Africa who, were the first hunters moving beyond gathering. We didn't have the advantage of claws or fleet feet like the cheetah, right? So how did we fell our prey? How did we get to the deer, right? Because the deer were far faster than us. So we just kept going after them until literally they dropped dead, right? But how did we know that we could keep going, and how did we know where the deer were going to be? That was the first act of throwing our thoughts based on patterns. We saw that if the deer went in this direction, this is how much farther they would go, and then keep going in that direction. So we could get there before them, and then wait for them to come and drop dead of exhaustion, pretty much, right? So that was the first act of imagination, pretty much, and it happened because of running, but it also happened because of us walking upright, and which meant that there was more oxygen going into our brains and expanding our brains. Um, when I read that passage in that book, I was like, it's as fundamental as that, right?
Yeah.
And we tend to forget it.
Well, that's remarkable. I'm definitely going to read that. There's a book I've come across recently that I haven't read but bought. It's I'm forgetting the title. I've got it lying around somewhere. It's by Haruki Murakami, who he's, I don't know if you know, he's a runner, right?
Yeah,
He's
what I talk about when I talk about running.
yeah. Have you read that?
Yes,
Okay, you recommend it?
absolutely.
Right.
I would recommend anything by Murakami.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so cool. Because I don't run marathons, but I love to run long distance. I always have, and I found that like, um, it's not a particularly intelligent metaphor here, but I feel like my mind is almost like a. So I meditate a lot, and I feel what that does, it almost like takes care and settles all the sediment from daily life, right? It either filters it out or it just sort of like uh, makes it less chaotic and frenetic and stills it. But sometimes you need that stuff like moving around your brain, right, to actually come up with ideas. So I love using the tools of almost meditation and running together. One to inspire stillness, and the other to almost inspire like a chaos. So I find it really hard to like these days to run without stopping, not because of like tiredness or exhaustion, but I just have to like make some notes, right? Or like write something down, or an observation or an insight or something that I will, know on later. But this is one, okay, I love these stories. I'd love to hear perhaps a crystallizing story from your own life and your own, again, personal or professional experience. I found that oftentimes when inspiration strikes, it is a really almost like cinematic moment, right? Most of our daily life, it happens in a blur, and we retain very, very little, and we recollect very little. But when you have a big idea or an insight for a campaign or anything, oftentimes for whatever reason, that it's almost tattooed on your brain. So I'd be curious if you have any such memorable incidents to share. You've shared so many like immense stories from, let's say, the outside world, but I'd love to hear from your own perspective as well, from your own life rather.
And related to an idea that might have resulted in something in work, or not really?
Work, or it doesn't need to be. It could be something that, I don't know, help you run faster, last longer, whatever it may be. But yeah, you pick your context.
Wow. Okay. Now you've got me at a bit of a loss. Let me take the easy one.
Sure.
A quick one, which resulted in something with work. Um, and it's funny how the dots connect not just across different subjects, but also sometimes across time, right?
Yep.
Um, so one of my first jobs, this was when I was in the US. My first job interview, my the person who was interviewing me, she took me out for lunch and grilled me for over an hour, and then she said, "Okay, it sounds like you're reasonably intelligent, and that you're willing to work hard, and you know this business. But tell me something: are you lucky?" And I didn't know how to answer that question. So I said, I don't know. So she said, okay, I'll take a chance on you. And she did. And she gave me a job. And I mean, I can go into details about so many things that I learned from her. But almost 12 years later, um, I just got a brief from a job portal, this monster.com. And as we were walking out of the briefing, my creative partner and I were walking out of the briefing, and I said, you know what? I think I know what we need to do here, right? I think I now know the answer to what my then boss asked me when she asked me if I was lucky, right? And the thing is, when you are applying for a job, um, nobody says better qualifications next time or better opportunity next time. They say better luck next time if you don't get it,
Nice.
right? Or best of luck or good luck, right? Why do they say that, right? It's not like they can manufacture luck, but why do they say that? And that's when it struck me that actually what luck is the intersection of opportunity and preparedness, right? So when opportunity knocks, are you ready for it, right? And that's what she was asking me, and I realized it 12 years later. Um, and I mean, I shared this with my colleague, and I think within an hour he had the script written, which got made without any change, pretty much. Um, but yeah, that was one occasion I would say when dots connected.
Wow, that is remarkable. What a remarkable story and insight. I've never thought about that before, and it's so true.
Yeah.
My mind also fired in a slightly different direction as you were chatting. This notion of dots connecting not just across disciplines but across like time, and there's a real temporal aspect to that, right? And what I found, this is a very very different conversation, that we may have on this in this conversation, one that we may not, but it's in many ways it's what's brought us together here today, and that is creative technologies and artificial intelligence. And I've been thinking about this a lot, this dimension of time and internet, and why I'm professionally really bullish on AI and technologies like AI becoming phenomenal, inspiration, brainstorming partners. Because ultimately, if you're sitting in a room with a few people bouncing around ideas, by no means am I dismissing that experience. I think that's a really, really important and sacred experience, right? It's a key part of the creative process. But what I find fascinating about algorithms and technology is that there are just so many dots that have been, documented and published on the internet, and these span time, right? I know the internet has a lot of issues. There's bias. There's the fact that it's pretty much indexed only on one language, right? And there's a lot that it's missing, and yet I don't think we can afford to dismiss lightly how many dots there are. And if you can organize those, if you can synthesize those, and if you can apply the right, let's say, natural language processing algorithms, you can theoretically be brainstorming with Hemingway, right? Or a part of Hemingway, and a part of Conan Doyle, and a part of Sherlock Holmes. I find that just whole body of work absolutely fascinating. And it links to a lot of the work that we're doing and the stuff that we're thinking about as well. And that is that, I think when you're at the beginning of a creative process, it's so important to not commit too quickly, right? I think it takes a real. I don't think anyone's cracked this either. This is something we experienced when we were building Inspo and talking to so many people in conversations that like brainstorming, whilst it's a beautiful process, it's also riddled with a lot of problems, right? Some of those mechanical problems, some of those almost just human problems and ego, right? How do you get heard in a conversation? How do you almost like ensure like create longevity in that conversation, so we don't necessarily just latch on to the first idea that we have, and actually we go broad before going deep, and we go broad in a really interesting, chaotic, frenetic way. So anyways, I'm not really sure where I'm going with this, but I just like that concept of the dots connecting over time. For me, it's not just words, but there's a real tangible visual metaphor there. Yeah, and I love how you applied it to your own life, right? You at different stages in your life, and I feel it can apply to us as people today, us as people tomorrow, and everyone that has been as well. So it's a really, it's a very powerful thought. I'd be curious, since we're on this topic of technology, what's your relationship with technology? And I'd like to link this back to something you said a little bit earlier. So it's clear that you read a lot of books, right? And you like to explore, right, the world and get out there, and you're just born with restless genes. But what's your relationship with the internet, with sort of your daily consumption of information, and how has that perhaps changed over the last like pandemic that we've been through, like your process of getting inspired and just nourishing yourself intellectually? How has that shifted, if at all?
No, I think there's been a somewhat gradual shift, and I won't say it's bad at all. To be honest, I mean, I've been hooked to the internet pretty much for as long as I can remember, because I don't see it as old versus new technology. I remind myself that technology by itself is actually a medium.
Yep.
It is not an output. It is not a solution. It is a means through which you can access things that either you couldn't access before, or you can access them more easily or faster, or in better ways. So in that sense, I'm very much a fan of technology that enables all of that. I mean, I think even before the pandemic, I wake up with my phone and scroll through stuff. I think I've signed up for pretty much every social channel that has been debuted from, I don't know if I should be admitting, from MySpace and Orkut onto wherever we are now.
Oh, I love it.
But for the most part, I'm probably inactive on 95% of them. The thing that I use the most, and the thing that I find the most useful, is probably Twitter.
Yep.
And I use it not so much for connections or networking or even commenting, so much as a source of knowledge. I think over time I've learned to filter out the noise and try to focus on the signal that is useful. But at the same time, I'm conscious of the fact that not all conversations, not all knowledge is about meaning. There's a lot of fun to be had in the meaningless stuff, and I for one I'm all for memes and the nonsense. The two things that I think I've been guided by, one are that I have this lasting love for books, so I'm conscious of not reducing my time for books, and so it took me until the beginning of last year before I finally signed up for any of the OTT platforms.
Okay.
Because I was always a little afraid that I would get hooked and then I wouldn't have time to. I have signed up for all of them, but I still watch very sparingly.
Yeah.
And the other is actually an insight that struck home a few years back when I was listening to what's his name, the director of The Revenant, Um, you remember that movie, the Leo Caprio movie, right?
I do.
Uh,
I forgot who the director is though.
I was speaking about this to somebody just the other day, but I've forgotten. Anyway, so he was posed a very fundamental question, and he was asked, "What do you think of all of the advanced technologies that are available to movie makers now? Mixed reality, VR, all of that stuff." And I loved how he broke it down to the most basic concept of storytelling and movie making. He said, if you think about it, from the time the Lumiere brothers premiered their first movie making and movies have always been about the willing suspension of disbelief. Technology is aiding us in that mission even now, and maybe even better than before. So if I'm able to suspend your disbelief even more willingly using technology, I say bring it on. And I think to that extent, internet technologies, if they can aid us in collecting those thoughts, more power.
I feel the flip side of that perspective is something that you can see. I personally feel with Disney, right? So the most striking example for me was The Lion King, right? So I was as a kid, I think every kid has that one defining Disney film that like defines so much of who you are and like
Yeah.
your sort of like formative years. And for me, it was definitely The Lion King. I've watched the movie thousands of times, like took rocks from my garden and made Pride Rock at home, and like that whole thing. But what I found fascinating is that I was so excited when they were remaking the movie, but equally nervous because I thought, oh, this is clearly a lot to live up to. And I personally, like, whilst I enjoyed it, I was left feeling somewhat underwhelmed. And I was trying to unpack that a little bit, like why? Because it was remarkable, right? It was a remarkable feat of technology. But sometimes I feel like almost the beauty of those early Disney films and those early they were literally illustrations, was the fact that they were low fidelity, right?
Yeah.
They unapologetically lacked detail, and you would almost project so much of that detail and so much of that meaning onto it as you watch. The same thing that we do with novels, right? I feel like when we read a novel, what's happening in your head is very, very different to what's happening in mine, right? We could be reading the same page, but like that process of meaning making is so intimate, it's so personal, and it's so unique. It impacts us, uniquely. So, by the way, I'm completely with you on that point of suspension of disbelief. I just feel like there's such a fine balance, right? And we've got to figure out some things I feel are in the service of technology, and some things are in the service of storytelling, and technology just happens to be an enabler. And I feel, at least for like art and movies and fiction and everything else, we probably need to be in the latter because we do need technology plays such an enormous role in that process, and it's truly an enabler, and it can serve us. But I feel like an overindulgence and reliance of it, we almost lose our bearings of like, why are we doing this in the first place, right? You may as well have written a thesis rather than produce a movie.
Yeah. No, you just said it so well. Is it in the service of storytelling or is it in the service of technology? Because technology is the servant, not the master.
Right.
And if you forget that, then I think then you're constraining yourself.
Do you feel that we are beginning to forget that?
Some of us are, not all of us. Some of us are. Uh, I wrote this piece. Once in a while, I'll just explore random topics that I have no credible expertise in. And I explored some of the darker sides of human nature in this essay that I wrote called Wired for Negativity. What I've explored was there is something that connects the couch potato with the serial killer. Okay? And it is this notion that I can get away with doing the thing that is either the least bit wrong or the highest bit wrong. But I can get away with wrongdoing is the same underlying tenet, right? Somebody else will move my ass. I don't need to move mine. Worse, and somebody else can pay the price for my crime, not me. It's the same thing. And I think that that tenet of laziness, if you will, is probably why we can err on the side of serving technology versus harnessing technology. This guy called Kevin Kelly, who used to be the editor-in-chief of Wired magazine,
Yep.
I think he once said, as long as AI stands for artificial intelligence and not artificial imagination,
Right.
we're safe from the robots.
Interesting. If we, I wanted to go back to something you've kind of touched upon in a number of stories and answers you've shared today, and that is the difference between, knowledge, information, and insight. Right. I think at the start of this conversation, you dismissed the value of collecting too much information or knowledge, and actually it's about collecting insight, right? Or at least cultivating insight. So I'll be curious. I often don't like to get into the business of overly defining certain things because I feel like most definitions are incredibly limited, and as soon as we attempt to define something and build four walls around it, like we've lost the plot entirely. But I'd be curious if you can just elaborate on what insight means to you, and how do you even arrive at insight? Like, is it something that is is completely different from a piece of information, or can a piece of information be synthesized together with other pieces to arrive at an insight or to become an insight?
Yeah, I mean, this again is a very subjective and highly contentious topic, I know. The way I approach it, at least, is information at best is descriptive.
Yep.
Insight is explanatory.
Okay.
Right? You can know what is going on based on information, but you need the insight to figure out why something is the way it is, someone is the way they are. And it need not be a never before way of looking at it. It just tells you why. And I think that revelatory nature of the insight then lets you get to, so what else can we do with this piece of information?
I'd be curious on how your perspective on this topic has changed through your career, because I stalked you a little online before this conversation, and I saw that you started your career as a copywriter. Is that right? Yeah. Right, and perhaps more on the traditionally creative side of advertising and business in the world. Even though I use speech marks there because I feel like regardless of what we do, creativity is absolutely required, right? And I always take personal issue with this when creativity and strategy, people seem to sever the two, when that to me doesn't, that's not how it works at all. But anyways, rabbit hole perhaps for a different conversation. And then you seem to have as you've progressed in your career perhaps moved more onto the business and strategy side of things. So I'd love to hear a little bit just about that journey and how you navigated that journey, and how perhaps your relationship with creativity and creative thinking changed, again, if at all, along the way.
This might seem a little too facile when I say it the way I say it now, but in a lot of ways it has not changed. I think somebody aptly said, and you almost said it, creativity is not a department.
Right.
Right. And I don't think I'm doing anything other than finding ways to use creativity to solve problems.
Right.
I just used words to string them together in a way that the public would see them. And as a copywriter, now I'm a little bit more of the medium for someone else to craft the final expression, if you will. And even with the business side of things, it is the same journey, I feel. And again, one other boss of mine who gave me a lasting lesson. This is about 12 years ago now. Um, I'm a bit of a naive person when it comes to dealing with office politics, um, and so this organization that I was in, I won't name it. After a couple of years there, I went up to the boss and I said, "I can't do this. I'm too old to learn to play games." And he said, "But you'll have to learn." I said, "I'm sorry. This is how I work. I can't do this, right?" So I quit, and my direct boss at that time, the planning head of the agency, he met me on my last day. I think if he had met me a few days prior to that, I might not have quit. And he met me and he said, "So you're telling me that you're setting out to create ideas that will persuade thousands, if not millions of people, but you can't persuade your colleagues to see your point of view?" Uh,
Ah,
right? And I think it drove home this lesson that ultimately all creativity, especially in our business, is about persuading people and therefore understanding people, and goes back again to insight, understanding why people behave the way they do, and that there's no pattern to it. People just change. I mean, there's a guy called Dan Ariely who I think has one of the best descriptions of people, that we are predictably irrational. We like to think ourselves as rational creatures, but we're not. So whether it's a business problem, whether it is a strategy problem or a craft problem, um, I always look at creativity as the answer, right? I mean, as somebody said, creativity is the answer. What's the question?
yeah. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about um, how do you almost cultivate creativity in your teams? Because now maybe as in one day as an individual copywriter, as you said, you synthesized words and you hoped that they would persuade. And I know that's a crude depiction of what the role requires, but let's just say if we abstract away a few levels, that's basically what copywriting is. And you do your job and you'd go home, and you either did it well or you didn't. But now I guess you're responsible for teams and so many other people, and so it's not just you know you're not only thinking about yourself and your creative tank and how filled it is, but actually you're trying to create and cultivate environments where teams are inspired and they're nourished and they're filled. I'd love to hear how you've approached that through your career, and again, then in the context of this pandemic, because things have changed so much for people, right? Like before we started recording, we were talking about how like we're able to take meetings now that we never thought were possible before this pandemic. We thought everything had to happen in person. I remember at the time, actually, just before the pandemic hit, I was speaking to a lot of agencies, and people refused to take Zoom calls, right? You had to fly out to another city, and it was just not an efficient use of time for like a 25-minute conversation and then to go all the way back. And that's completely flipped on its head. So yeah, I'd love to get your thoughts on these.
So there's a phrase that I encountered again sometime in this journey to where I am today. There are two words that are part of this phrase, and I think I'll try to unpack both of them. And the phrase is appreciative inquiry, right? And the appreciation part of it is pertinent both to people as well as to the status quo, if you will, or what came before you, right? Is not to be dismissive about either the person asking or the context and the point from which they are asking something or presenting something. And the inquiry part of it is the part that says be curious, question a lot, don't take good enough as good enough, right? I used to be all about the questioning. I used to be all about questioning the status quo, questioning what is, questioning the idea on the table, questioning the process, because without the questions, you're not going to find the answers. And so I think I placed a lot of emphasis on just asking questions, and in the course of it, you'll find the right question and therefore the right answer also. But I think the second part of it, which is the appreciation part of it, is probably even more necessary in these days. It always was, but what it demonstrates is you're coming from a point of view of empathy. Um, in, in some ways, there's a technique that Google uses in their brainstorming workshops. The phrase that they ask every participant to replace is yes, but. When somebody else presents a point of view, they say, don't say yes, but, say yes, and. Right?
Right.
So, which is so much more of not just collaboration, but it builds on what came before you, right? And I have this thinking process which says, if someone comes up to you and says they have a better idea than yours, then hear them out. If indeed it is better, then you're both winning.
Yep.
And if they're not better, then the egg is not on your face.
Yep.
So either way, you win, right? So I think the empathy side of appreciation, as well as um, the not settling for good enough part of inquiry, those are the two that I try to use especially in these times. But I think, yeah, I tell people who seek me out that the only advantage I have over anybody else in the room is not intelligence, it's not knowledge, it's not smarts or anything. I've just been around for longer. So I've just gathered more dots. I've just gathered more dots because I've had a time advantage over you. Um,
That's so wonderfully articulated, and you've almost given me like the perfect segue into the final piece of this conversation. So yeah, in the spirit of good inquiry and asking great questions, just before we got on this call, I spent a few minutes playing around on Inspo, our search engine for inspiration, and I asked you, right, like what are your interests and topics? And you've already mentioned this in the chat as well, that you like to get outside, travel, right? So I was curious, and I just entered the word travel to see what inspo would throw out at me. And it actually really blew my mind. It was just, I think, a quick 5-6 minutes of going through all of the generated pieces of AI content and thought starters. And I wanted to throw some at you right now. And yeah, I'd love you just to react to them. Some of them are questions, some of them are just perspectives, and maybe we can just jam and see how it goes. I warn you, it's the algorithm. It's a little bit unhinged. I think that's what makes it so beautiful. Like it's truly inhuman at times, but that makes us question our own humanity as well, which I think is always a useful exercise. So let's start with this was just an AI idea. It was generated using the GPT-3 algorithm, but also creative associations from Inspo and the Haiku Jam social writing game, right? And the idea is this: travel is the only thing you buy that makes you richer.
I don't know if I'm evolved enough to reject materialistic pleasures in life. I think I like my creature comforts. But yeah, I mean, if you want to measure your wealth, travel is actually one of the things that will make you possibly wealthy enough to not want other stuff. But I guess you need the wealth to travel as much as you want to begin
Yep.
with. Yeah.
100%, definitely. Here's another one. I really love this, actually. So traveling leaves you speechless and then turns you into a storyteller.
Yeah. And one of my favorite quotes is from this book by John Steinbeck. And minor plug over here, I've written a travel book, about 60,000 words, and not got it published yet. But the title of the book is from this quote from the Steinbeck book called Travels with Charlie. And he says, one goes not so much to see, but to say afterward. I couldn't agree more with what you just said.
Amazing.
Yeah.
What's plug away. Tell us more about if you're happy to share, what are you writing?
It's a book of travel essays, travels over the last 10, 15 years. It's a very personal perspective on the people, more than the places. It's about the people that I've met and interacted with, and I'm an inveterate people watcher. I think sometimes I have to be dragged away from the blatant, glaring staring that I do. I describe myself as a travelogler. I like to travel and I like to ogle. So I'm not just a traveler, but also a travelogler. And each of the essays is punctuated by a poem that was either written in the place that I was or inspired by the emotion that I felt at that time. So yeah, and it's half of the travels are inside India and half of them are outside. In some sense, I don't think it was a conscious attempt either during the journeys or during the time of writing. But invariably, all of them came back to a singular point, which was around the idea of stillness.
Right.
Yeah, so I can bore you a lot more with the book, but maybe one of these days when it's published, I'll send you a copy.
Please do, and we can maybe do another conversation. We'll just talk about the book and the inspiration for that. So wonderful. So let me just throw one last question at you. So again, generated by GPT-3 and creative associations. If you could travel the world with your mind, where would you go?
Can I reject half of the question?
Of course.
Yeah, I think I like the visceral nature of travel, so I don't know if I want to travel only with my mind.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a multisensorial thing, and it's not just about what you experience with your mind. So I don't know. Yeah.
No, I share that view as well. So here was another that was generated alongside that particular thought, and they're kind of interlinked. So we can end on this one. How does traveling change the way that we think?
There's a very simple thing that I do from time to time, just so I shake myself out of my own complacency. The same places that I go to multiple times, I every once in a while change the route that I take to get there.
Ah, nice.
So either the route or how I get there, right? So either on foot or I'm not driving, I'm the passenger, or I take a bus or a train or some other means, just so I'm able to see the things that I'm seeing with different eyes. And I think it is a replacement for when I cannot go to a new place to see a place anew, if you will. That is for me at the root of it. That's travel, to see with new eyes.
The same goes with great books as well, that it's so wonderful to come back to them after like every few years, and you realize that it's a new book that you're reading. And I always I'm like a very aggressive note taker inside the books, and I always look at those notes and feel almost disenfranchised and just a little disorientated, like what on earth was I thinking, right? Like that's not a question that even bothers me now. That's not even a rabbit hole that I choose to go down now, but it was when I was like, in high school or wherever. So
It's always a fabulous rabbit hole to go down.
I couldn't agree more. So Narayan, one last question and request to leave you with. This has been such an enriching, enlightening conversation. So I found in life that oftentimes when people or situations or contexts inspire us, oftentimes we just keep it to ourselves, right? We don't actually let them know. So I've made it like and I think that's such a shame, because it would, if the person is still alive, it would probably make their day knowing that their work or their expression has triggered this chain reaction of inspiration. So yeah, just as a final question, if there's anyone who's inspired you recently, would you like to give them a shout out and maybe just share a few words?
Well, the most recent one is obviously that girl in Bundelkhand in
Of course. Yeah.
her name is Jaya, and she's cut off from social media. So I doubt she'll get to hear this or see this. But if somebody somehow, through the chain of connections that we seem to have, if she's able to hear it, I would probably name her.